Although the purpose of this video isn't to venture into the great Marvel DC divide, it's fair to say that America's favourite Burbank-bound publisher, DC, have hit out more than their fair share of seminal storylines over the years. Time and again, writers, artists, colorists, and inkers have set about refuting the notion that comics are nothing more than idle funny books. In doing so, DC are able to boast an entire library of all-time greats, books that stand up and proclaim, with great dignity, that comics can be so much more than they're often held to be. And that's no small feat, mind you. Of all the thousands of comics published, the only one to make it onto Time's 100 greatest novels of all time is a DC work. That, and when you think of the most iconic storylines of the medium, those that extend beyond the Marvel bullpen era, you think DC. You think of the Frank Millers, the Alan Moores, the Denny O'Neills. All of them, in some way, define their careers at DC. While this list can serve a purpose in definitively ranking the publisher's greatest hits, it's also worth noting that we've tried to include books that fans old and new should be able to seek out and appreciate. I'm Ewan from WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 DC graphic novels you must read before you die. Number 10. The Question, Zen and Violence. Dennis O'Neil is an absolute legend of the comics medium, kicking things off with a stellar run on Batman that totally redefined the character after the 60s. O'Neil would set his sights to a plethora of comic book icons. Green Arrow, Green Lantern, and even Marvel's Daredevil have all benefited from the writer's penmanship, but it is The Question who owes him the most. Created by Spider-Man co-creator Steve Ditko for Charlton Comics in 1967, the character was originally envisioned as a hot-headed hero, spearheaded by the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Time had passed, and the character was one of the several to make the leap to DC in the 80s, when Charlton was bought out. Alan Moore famously wanted to use him in his original concept for Watchmen, but DC held firm and, but a few years later, the character was given to O'Neil. Together with artist Dennis Cohen, O'Neil reinvented Ditko's creation and turned him into an anti-corruptionist philosopher, one with a major internal struggle and a fierce demeanour to boot. While Zen and Violence in no way represents the pinnacle of O'Neil's run, that honour goes to the third volume, Epitaph for a Hero, it does serve as a great jumping-on point for it and establishes many of the themes and philosophies the writer would approach in the series' later stages. Also, Rorschach does suck. Number 9. Green Lantern, Green Arrow. After his run on Batman, O'Neil and frequent collaborator Neil Adams jumped onto Green Lantern, Green Arrow. While that might seem like an odd pairing at first, what with the pair only having the green motif to share between them, O'Neil managed to pioneer one of the medium's most iconic relationships during this period. Founded with the intent of exploring the Nixonian United States, the series saw Oliver Queen and Hal Jordan embark on a fear and loathing styled road trip across the country, with Queen taking the position of the left-wing social justice activist, and Jordan that of the conservative stalwart. The pair would spar verbally and physically throughout the series, with the book at times looking more like a social critique of Nixon's America more so than a simple superhero comic. It's undeniably brilliant though, and while an image of a drug-addled Speedy may dominate reflections of the book, there is so much more to it than that. Another intelligent work from one intelligent writer. Number 8. Static Shock, Rebirth of the Cool. There's so much that can be said about Static, the classic milestone character created by the late, great Dwayne McDuffie. Fans will most likely recognise Virgil Hawkins from the animated series of the same name, or indeed in Justice League Unlimited, but most of his best material was reserved for his own comic series. An African-American high school student caught up in a toxic cocktail of gun crime and police violence, Virgil discovers he has the power to manipulate and generate electricity after being hit by the Big Bang, an event that gave birth to an array of superpowered citizens in Milestone's famous Dakotaverse. Although the character's initial run was lauded upon its release, the character fell out of the spotlight after said series was cancelled. With McDuffie then heavily involved in the burgeoning DC animated universe, a cartoon show was created and, wouldn't you know it, people loved him. McDuffie was then able to use the hero's newfound popularity and resurrect the original Milestone series. Now set in the mainstream DCU and not the Milestone Dakotaverse, Rebirth of the Cool was the comic every fan of the animated series wanted to read. It didn't just complement the TV series, however. What it did do was reaffirm that Milestone's tenets, to strive for a more representative industry, are as important today as they were back then. Number 7. Sandman, Preludes and Nocturnes. You don't even have to be a comics fan to know that Neil Gaiman is the real deal. One of the finest fantasy and horror writers of all time, Gaiman has lent his talents to DC on numerous occasions, none of which are more famous than his stint on Sandman. When it was originally published, the comic transcended stereotypes about the medium's readership, pulling in an audience who, for the most part, weren't all that concerned with the costumes and capes that occupied the big two's universes. The comic itself was suitably atmospheric, with Gaiman having tapped into something special with the series' protagonist, Dreamer of the Endless. Further to that was the writer's masterful use of mythology, fantasy, and horror, which in turn elevated the book to new storytelling heights altogether. It really is one of the finest novels of our time. You don't make it onto the New York Times bestseller list for nothing, after all. Number 6. Jack Kirby's New Gods. Although Jack Kirby has managed to develop a certain level of synonymy with Marvel, owing to the raft of characters he co-created along with Stan Lee, John Romita, and Steve Ditko, the writer-artist truly excelled while at DC. Having switched sides in 1970, dissatisfied with his treatment at Marvel, Kirby set about unleashing his full artistic potential. Creating what would later be called the Fourth World Saga, Kirby introduced us all to a world of new gods, cosmic architecture, and a bevy of brilliant characters that are still making waves today. Every DC fan should know who Darkseid is, but it's not just the villainous Lord of Apocalypse who's worthy of attention. Orion, Mr. Miracle, and Big Barda were all conceptualized in this saga too, and while Kirby's time at DC tends to get overlooked by mainstream narratives, his time spent with the new gods in particular made for one of the most influential story arcs of all time. Number 5. HELLBLAZER, Original Sins. John Constantine, no, not Constantine, Tyne, is probably the coolest British comics character out there. A bisexual scouser with a penchant for the occult, the character was originally introduced in Alan Moore's seminal Swamp Thing series in 1984, but later found renewal in a comic of his own 4 years later. Dubbed the HELLBLAZER, Jamie Delano's opening 3 years on the book are some of the best DC have ever had. Politically charged, witty, and atmospheric above all else, Delano's story of an occult anti-hero pushing against supernatural forces is as timeless as it is classic, a centerpiece to the British invasion as much as it is a hallmark of DC's Vertigo imprint. It's just brilliant all around, and conveys in no small way just how pivotal a character he was during the late 80s. Subsequent writers would take on the character, including industry bigwigs like Garth Ennis, Warren Ellis, and fellow Liverpudlian Mike Carey, but Delano's stint on the book is certainly the most iconic Hellblazer we've ever gotten. Just don't tell that to Keanu. Number 4. Batman, The Dark Knight Returns. Frank Miller might have lost his way over the millennium, and while the writer's legacy today isn't what it once was, Miller's tale of a retired Batman coming out of the shadows to prowl the streets once more is a staple of the superhero genre. You can't go without it. Not only did it fundamentally redefine the character, in that Miller elected to depict the Caped Crusader more as a force of nature than as a simple superhero, it marked a tonal shift in superhero comics too. Along with Alan Moore's Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns plotted a new course for the medium we now know today, and while the merits of such a shift are still being debated, there's no denying that the day The Dark Knight returned was one comics fans everywhere had to savor. You know, as long as you can forgive it for inspiring Batman v Superman. Number 3. All-Star Superman. Speaking of supes, there's no way we could neglect All-Star Superman, Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely's opus to the Man of Tomorrow and everything he embodies. All-Star revolves around the Man of Steel as he comes to terms with a terminal diagnosis of solar radiation poisoning. Morrison sets about telling a story that celebrates everything Superman is meant to be, and Quitely, ever the visionary, conveys it beautifully. I dare not spoil the story for readers yet to pick it up, but one thing that everyone must know is that All-Star is the finest Superman story ever told. It fundamentally distills the essence of the world's most famous superhero, and does so in a way that will make even the steeliest of hearts beat with feeling. Number 2. DC, The New Frontier. The late Darwin Cook was one of the finest creators of our time, and no book proclaims that more loudly than The New Frontier. As much a homage to DC's Golden and Silver Ages as it is a thematic reappraisal of them, Cook's magnum opus roots itself squarely in the zeitgeist of the long 1960s, beginning in the McCarthyist milieu of the early 50s, and ending with the commencement of JFK's New Frontier speech in 1960. It discusses everything, from the civil rights movement, the Red Scare, and, of course, the Cold War dynamic itself, and it places DC's heroes right in the thick of it. The New Frontier is masterful in its presentation and painstaking in its analysis, rooting these classic DC characters in a world the publisher was, at the time at least, reluctant to depict. And while hardcore DC fans will undoubtedly get the most out of Cook's work, in that it uses everything from Sergeant Rock to Dinosaur Island and more, there's something for everyone, whether they be a student of the 60s, a superhero fan more generally, or indeed a fan of literature in all its forms. Number 1. Watchmen. You won't find a stronger comic book than Alan Moore's Watchmen. You just won't. Seminal in so many ways, and revolutionary in many more, Moore and Dave Gibbons' text is almost universally considered to be the finest comic book of all time. With its gripping social commentary on the 80s Cold War milieu, and its satire of the superhero genre in particular, Watchmen continues to captivate readers 30 years on from its original publishing. That's no small feat, and while continued revivals of the license prove to be controversial, it's easy to see why DC are so keen to trap the same lightning Moore and Gibbons did when the text first released in 1986. It's a testament to Moore's work that the book's most famous characters, Rorschach, Night Owl, Dr. Manhattan, and Silk Spectre, are household names. To do that outside of the limits the mainstream DCU engenders is incredible, and the fact that it keeps being revisited intimates how special a feat that is, in accordance to the book's ever-increasing popularity. Sure, fans might continue to misread Rorschach, but when the book's as good as it is, sure that's a price worth paying. And that's our list. Were there any other comics that we missed? Any you want to recommend to fans below? Let us know in the comments. As always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and be sure to head over to whatculture.com for more top-notch comics coverage every day. I've been Ewan, and I'll see you next time.